Hello there and welcome to the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair. A very warm welcome to you, to all of our audience here who are live with us in Abu Dhabi. It's great that you've taken the time to come and be with us. And of course to our wonderful audience live virtually around the world. Thank you so much for joining us. As always, we've got a wonderful lineup for you today, and I'm going to kickstart this entire session looking at how the pandemic has shifted the power of geopolitics. And we'll take a look at that with two great speakers and two great experts in terms of history and in terms of current affairs, and see what's going on here. And they're joining me here, so they are virtually. I'm delighted to be joined by Jeremy Black. Jeremy, a British historian, retired professor from the University of Exeter and fellow at the Centre of Study of America and West at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Jeremy, I have a long list here and I wouldn't even know where to start on all the books that you have published, but you have so many, and an expert in history and indeed warfare, so I'm absolutely delighted you're with us, and we'll unveil some of your great work as we talk in the next hour. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
I'd also like to introduce Dr. Parag Khanna, and he is founder and managing partner of FutureMap. Has also written many, many books too, and I'm really looking forward to speaking to you and finding out what's going on here. A big player with the World Economic Forum, an expert in foreign policy, and again, looking at that wonderful book that I haven't quite finished the full book, but I've certainly got through quite a bit of it, looking at the shift in power to Asia. So Parag, thank you so much. The future is Asian. We'll talk a little bit about that. In fact, we'll probably talk a lot about that. So thank you both for being with us.
Sure.
Now, Jeremy, if I may start with you, and given your background and indeed your deep knowledge of history, let's just take a look at the geopolitics of the world right now. Where do we sit? Who's running the show globally, if we could put it that way? What's going on and what has changed?
Well, I think what's changed is less due to the pandemic and more due to processes that were already at play. I think, as Parag has shown in his excellent work, I think we've had a rise in Asia, which is exactly what you would expect. A large amount of the world's population is in Asia, a lot of its productive capacity is in Asia. Parts of Asia were without a doubt held back politically, and you can still see that process in, for example, North Korea. But on the whole, the political situation in Asia has been much more benign in recent decades, which has helped it move forward from what otherwise had been a position in which it hadn't done so well in the last few centuries.
Parag, join us here and pick up on this one here. Clearly, you've looked at the whole region, but I mean, the big focus has to be really on China, and particularly in the last 10 years. What's been going on there and that escalation in terms of China's rise to power? Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. Yes and no in terms of answering that question from your part, because I'm very glad that Jeremy referred to the last few hundred years. It's a very appropriate and accurate assessment on his part. Asia has been divided from itself in many ways internally due to the two historical sort of forces of the last 500 years, colonialism and the Cold War. Colonialism taking up much of the last 500 years and the Cold War, the latter part of the 20th century. And during that period, of course, the internal relationships within Asia, the intra-Asian intensity of ties and gravity was ruptured in many ways. And what we've seen over the last 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union is Asia rapidly recover that internal interdependence. I'm not going to call it unity, I'm not going to call it convergence. It's really just a story of recovering complementarities. Others would call it the new Silk Roads. And the extent to which that process has evolved in just 30 years is absolutely staggering, because Asia has gone from this state of fragmentation to having more than 60% of its trade be internal. It's formed its own diplomatic institutions, it drives its own agenda. The region is still rife with conflict. China has tensions, strong tensions, with every single one of its neighbors, right? Almost. There's no doubt about it. So China is at the heart of the region. China is a geopolitical superpower on a global basis. and it is Asia's dominant power. However, it is not the only Asian story. I would submit that when we look back at this period, I'm not sure how far from now, but we will say that the overall rise of Asia and this 4.5 billion people is a bigger story than simply the rise of China itself. China is about 1/3 to 1/2 of that story, but it is not the whole story.
Jeremy, talk to me about the impact of the pandemic. I mean, this has been, right now, many of us assume that the origins of this have been, coming from Asia. There's even President Biden has put his own investigation out at the minute, so the jury's out in terms of where that's happening. But again, there's been a huge impact clearly around the world. What has the impact been on Asia? And also, I mean, has it caused any shift, would you say, in terms of geopolitical influence?
I think it's only accentuated already existing tendencies. I mean, the point to bear in mind is that the population of the world has been going up every day during the COVID pandemic. So this has not been the sort of pandemic of sort of traumatic apocalyptic fashion. This isn't the equivalent of the bubonic plagues of the past or of mass cholera epidemics. And I think that that's a very significant point. And the other thing, which, I mean, obviously at the individual level, this does not make this easier to listen to, but a key element of this pandemic is that it has very much hurt and harmed and killed people at the older age group. Now, that's not particularly pleasant to say, but what it does mean is that the most productive members of society, the most innovative members of society, are those with the very much lowest death rate. Whereas if you contrast it with, say, the influenza epidemic of 1918-19, that very much hit the young, very much hit pregnant women. In this pandemic, people are not having to get used to seeing their children die. I mean, they may be used to getting to see their parents die, but it's generally, if their parents are dying, it's people already over the age of 80. So in many senses, this is a pandemic that is more serious for the economic disruption it has brought than for its actual demographics. And indeed, I mean, it's worth bearing in mind the world is not short of people. We're not short of actually workers, if you like, and on top of that, with the trend towards artificial intelligence, the actual number of people in a society is possibly going to be less significant. And, you've mentioned, Pradak's very helpfully mentioned China. It's worth saying that whereas, for example, the Chinese military model under Mao Zedong was very much that of conscription, mass army, a conviction that in the event of war, such as, for example, a bigger version of the Korean War, that China would win by numbers. China from the 1980s and increasingly from the 2000s has put the emphasis not on numbers, but on technology, on an advanced professional military. So that's another way in which actual numbers themselves are seen as less consequential for the strength of a state than used to be the case.
Now, Parag, when we look at the state of the world pre-pandemic, I mean, things were very dynamic. Economic activity was robust, it was strong. There was so in many ways the brakes have been put on. But has the pandemic, would you say, done anything in terms of shifting geopolitical power, or do you think maybe what Jeremy is saying there, it's a temporary sort of tilt for the moment?
There were certain trends underway before the pandemic over the last 5 to 10 years that have been reinforced. And one of them is not talked about enough, which is regionalism. It's not something that most people have paid attention to, but in the middle of this pandemic, at a time when we presumed that every society was turning inward and nationalistic and protectionist, which was the trend pre-pandemic in some societies, actually, 3 of the largest steps ever taken towards regional integration were taken. The US-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, which some call NAFTA plus. The EU shifted from its monetary union towards also having some degree of fiscal coordination, and that's now going to be entrenched into European supranationalism in the future, again, through the back door in some ways, but it's real. And Asian countries, of course, agreed to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is now the largest free trade area in the entire world. So the fact that the 3 most significant geographical and economic and demographic pillars of the entire world economy simultaneously made steps towards regional integration in the middle of a pandemic tells you something about how important it is to think of the world as these regional zones, not just in terms of nation states alone. So I think that's one critical thing about the foundations of geopolitics being as much regional as a national. So that's one thing that, again, was happening before the pandemic and will accelerate afterwards because, of course, we had global demand shocks, we had ruptures in supply chains, we have more countries looking to their neighbors for solutions in energy, food, and other aspects. A lot more talk about regional self-sufficiency and so on. We'll still have globalization, we'll still have global interconnectivity, interdependence to some degree. However, there'll be a lot more push towards regional solutions. So that's just one point about, again, even though people talk about this is going to shift power and China is going to make a move and vaccine diplomacy and Belt and Road will take on a new dimension and countries will be so dependent on China. Hold on a minute, right? Let's not go overboard. Let's talk about just one other consequence of this pandemic, which is that to the extent that any country had any lingering, reason to trust China, which, by the way, was not really the case, no country does. So let's be absolutely clear that I cannot think of a society on the planet Earth that has any trust in China. And that includes even the countries that are considered Chinese allies, like Pakistan. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't work with China. China is the number one trading partner of more countries than any other country in the world. So to work with China, to engage with China, to trade with China is not the same as to trust China. And this is actually the big psychological disruption. I don't think that any country, any society will literally ever trust China. And I think that's probably a good, healthy thing.
Yeah, I was just about to say that maybe it is good and it's healthy, and I think Jeremy is here agreeing with that. And Jeremy, when we look at the most important political shift, the changing relationship between China and the US particularly, how is that going to have knock-on effects on the rest of the world? And again, come back to this element of, as Parag says, you can do business with China, you don't necessarily have to trust them, and perhaps that's a healthy thing too.
Yes, as Parag's bringing out, and I agree with his points, what in essence one has got is a transactional nature of relationships, and that transactional nature of relationships, which reflects in part distrust, but in part very much a kind of bilateralism, that, as it were, each agreement is thought of in its own terms. I think that's been very characteristic. But if we can just wind back a second, I agree that this is part of Parag's element of the emphasis on regions, because in a sense, during the Cold War, there were again two, if you like, dominant regions, the Western Alliance, and that was a political region, an economic region, a region of investment, and, if you like, the Communist bloc. The Communist bloc split with the Sino-Soviet bloc, but essentially the Communist bloc was not part of the Western system. So bringing up Parag's point, these were regionalisms. Now, in a way, at the end of the Cold War, those barriers were to a considerable extent dissolved. What that did was increase liquidity flows between the blocs, particularly, for example, a Western investment in Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet Union. Already there was investment in China, but that grew much more rapidly, so that you've got, to an extent, in the 1990s and the 2000s, as it were, a globalized liquidity market. Now, what's very unclear at the present moment is the way in which that aspect of geopolitics is going to develop. See, one way we might look at this period is we might look at this period not with the emphasis on the pandemic. We might sit here in 100 years' time and say the key characteristics of the 2010s and maybe the whole of the 2020s was the cheap money policies that were introduced in the late 2000s to help deal with that crisis, and that have been sustained through the 2010s. There was talk of tightening of money prior to the pandemic. Now, because of the enormous anxiety about economic problems, money has remaining cheap, and you might argue, there were a multiplicity of factors, but you might argue that it was President Trump's mishandling of the pandemic in the United States that helped President Biden win election on what was actually only a modest margin in many of the key states. If you take that viewpoint, and if you emphasize the enormous extent of, as it were, pushing money into the money supply, keeping money free almost, with very low interest rates, then that will be a key element. Now, as Pradak shows, what that actually then means is you've got a mass of inexpensive liquidity, but the actual decisions as to how to use that is being pushed in particular areas in part because of protectionism in the European case, in part in the East Asian case, because of, as he says, the attraction of trade within those areas as investors in places like Japan look for places where there's skill, where there's labor, where there's markets, and find those elsewhere in the Eastern Asian model. Now, how far that is exportable to help us with the area of the world where population rise is fastest, which is Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, is not clear. Because there you've got a different set of equations. Yes, there's plenty of money around, but actually Africa is not particularly money rich. Africa is politically unstable. The kind of ability that you've seen in the regional blocs discussed by Pradak in order to lessen or contain tension, or at least to encourage investment flows between countries that might otherwise not be terribly warm towards each other, that doesn't really operate successfully in Africa. So there you've got Nigeria is on its way to replacing America eventually as the country with the third largest population in the world. Whether that's to be seen in the long term as geopolitically benign or not is, I think, a very big question mark.
And one we'll, talk more about. I do want to talk about what's happening in Africa and the rise of Africa and the attention that needs to be put there. But Parag, if I can continue this part of the conversation, and we look, if anything, maybe the downside of the pandemic, while the liquidity that we're seeing and the fiscal, generosity, I suppose, around the world at the moment, this is all good. It's needed right now, and it's to be encouraged. But it all has to be paid back. So where is this going to leave us, post-pandemic, and who's going to be able to recover easily, perhaps?
Well, the expansion of the global money supply and the debt issuance and the rise of sovereign debt, just a caveat to that is a lot more of it now is local currency denominated. So it is viewed as somewhat more sustainable for these countries than if it were still US dollar denominated, especially if interest rates rise. But putting that to the side, we have been in that expansionary mode, of course, since 2008. And that partially accounts for the point that you made at the very beginning, which is that prior to the pandemic, the economy seemed to be humming along. We were in a period of a synchronized global recovery from the 2010s onward, and that had continued. Now, of course, we're in a situation where countries that don't have fiscal room to maneuver, that don't have enough liquidity in their own system, that haven't been able to borrow at cheap rates on international capital markets, they've been orphans. They've borrowed a lot. The IMF has issued well over $1 trillion of credit. The World Bank another 250 billion at least. Those numbers are growing. There is an intense behind-the-scenes conversation going on between European Paris Club creditors and China, trying to draw China into the conversation around some kind of a sustainable debt restructuring facility for the most affected countries in the world, so that they can afford to buy vaccines, shore up their healthcare systems, create jobs, and obviously protect their economies and their currencies from hyperinflation and so forth. And this is the reckoning. We can't generalize about how this will play out. Quite frankly, Asian economies, East Asian economies, and to some degree Central Asia are relatively immune from all of this, including Southeast Asia. These regions have matured considerably in the last 20 years since the Asian financial crisis of 1998. So here in this region that I live in, and again, this is a catchment area of well over 4 billion people, even with the pandemic raging in India as badly as it is, and as tragic as that situation is, India has enormous currency reserves. Its currency itself is stable. It's able to borrow, strong foreign investment still, massive infrastructure investment too. It's a governance failure, what's happened with their management of the pandemic, but it's one of the countries that you can hope and probably bet on learning the right lessons coming out of this. That's not the same assessment I would make of many countries of the global south, particularly in Africa and in South America. So those are really in a world unto themselves right now, and it's not a good place to be.
Parag, let's stay with that for a moment. Do you think that the countries in Asia are actually going to recover faster than any other countries in the world, given just what you've just said?
Well, I mean, they already have, right? I mean, if we look at to the extent that we can make any confident projections around the V-shaped economic recovery at the national or regional level, what you see is that there is obviously a substantial spike or rebound across the world, even in Western economies. But eventually, by 2022, 2023, even the US and most certainly the Eurozone fall back down to earth, below 3% growth. What you see for most Asian economies is that they stabilize at their pre-pandemic growth level, which was 5 to 6%. And I think we can count on that. I think that's a fairly robust prediction. Again, I'm watching this every single day. And let's remember that they're not only planning on simply building back or recovering, they're living that mantra, build back better. So the uptake in digitization, the increase in infrastructure investment, the rise of mobile payments, the investments in 5G telecommunications, all of these things, the new investments in public health, this is happening. Everything that we talk about in our Western societies in terms of what we should do with infrastructure and how we should do stimulus and how we should focus on jobs and wages, that stuff is already well underway here. Now, of course, the average Southeast Asian country or Asian society, their per capita incomes are lower than Western mature economies, of course. However, they are really actively pursuing this leapfrogging in which they're going to have, and in many cases, in the case of China, of course, already do have superior technology in many ways that enhances labor productivity. So I think we always have to remember that we cannot be judging countries' performance or future prospects solely on at what point they reach a 40 to 50,000 US dollar annual mean income. The fact is that the quality of life can be superior at a lower level of income if you have done a better job of incorporating the latest infrastructure standards and technologies. And that is well underway even in relatively poor Asian countries. So I don't want to sugarcoat the challenges. Again, in India, it's an utter disaster, a fiasco, a tragedy, a humanitarian nightmare. Just want to be clear that I'm not, sugarcoating anything. Yes. The Philippines has hunger, more acute hunger than it had before the pandemic. But I would say, just to be clear, even in the quasi-democratic countries of this region, there is an enormous pressure on governments to deliver. They will absolutely be thrown out onto the streets, even with whatever control over the police that they have, if they do not build back better. I give you my money back guarantee. And let's remember, again, we tend to look at East Asian countries, at developing Asian countries as being, partial democracies at best and illiberal societies. But the track record shows over the last 30 years, from the Philippines to Indonesia, that people are not afraid to go out in the streets and throw their leaders out if they don't pursue better governance, equitable governance, and modernization strategies.
Now, Jeremy, several years ago, we heard a lot about the growth of the BRIC economies on the back of what was happening in China, and indeed, not all the BRIC economies were based in Asia as well. Some of them doing better than others, and even as Parag was saying there, and he writes in his book about it, that concept of leapfrogging, because they don't have to go through, I think, some of the trials and tribulations that many older and more mature markets went through. But talk to us a little bit about the hope, I suppose, that you see for the BRIC economies. And we'll stay with Asia in a minute. I do want to come back to Africa and talk to you both about that in a moment. But the other economies, again, the Philippines, Indonesia, various countries in Asia, it's not all created equal in terms of development, poverty, economic growth, all of that.
Yes, well, I think, and again, I'm agreeing with Parag. I hope this is interesting for people. We're not having a row. I'm agreeing entirely with him. I think that the situation in the East Asian and Southeast Asian economies in particular reflect a very well-grounded, widespread economic situation. So, for example, there is not the reliance on commodity production that you would see in Russia, which is a much weaker BRIC economy than China. I also think that, as Parag is bringing out, when we're talking about the Philippines, for example, the Philippines is a society where part of the problem is the birth rate being high. Part of the problem is also the cost of government. Now, government is an advantage and a cost in any economic system. And in some East Asian and Southeast Asian societies, government is acting in a pretty benign fashion in the terms of the economy, encouraging, as Parag says, an emphasis on the future, encouraging an emphasis on improvement and improvability. In other societies, this is not true. I mean, as I've already mentioned, the economy in East and Southeast Asia that's in the most trouble is North Korea, and I don't think there's any doubt that that owes a lot to its government system. There's nothing particular about the people. I mean, South Korea shows how North Korea could do a lot better. So, I mean, government is a serious cost to the system. What is unclear is how far that cost can be bypassed. I mean, in a sense, as Parag's talking about India, for example, there is an enormous disjuncture in India between many dynamic economic stages, the broadening out of much of the economy, but also the extent to which a lot of regional government in India doesn't work terribly well, or it works as a system of patronage with the economic cost that comes through of corruption. The extent also to which, and the present government is facing difficulties here, the extent also to which the attempt to change agriculture and the pricing of agriculture in order to increase efficiency and to encourage a movement off the land comparable to that which has occurred in parts of East Asia, particularly China, as well as in Europe, as well as in the United States, that's hitting a lot of political problems. Now, one could take a benign or a less benign interpretation here, and one can do that across all political systems, whether they are constitutionally democracies or constitutionally not democracies. As Parag says, there is the issue of accountability. But the key thing here is, as a historian, which is what I am, but looking to the future, do I see a malign, less optimistic fear that in some societies the government will be unable to cope, partly because government will seek to bribe electorates that don't wish to see squeezes on their living standards, partly because there is the problem, particularly in certain kinds of birth structures, of large numbers of young, particularly young males, and the problems of acculturating them in a new system, and that can actually lead to high levels of instability. So have we got those problems, and should we be pessimistic about it, or should we be optimistic and say, well, yes, there will be some problems, there will be some failures, but the general direction of the world is towards more informed use of technological advances which are going to make society more benign and also possibly enable a lot of previous resource choke points over, for example, the use of energy or over the use of water to be lessened or to a degree overcome. And you could play it both ways.
Parag, in your book, in chapter 7, you talk about Afro-Eurasia. How important is the rise of Africa, or at the moment, sadly, maybe not the rise, because they've really been particularly heavy hit by the pandemic. They were debt-laden countries to start with. It's probably going to be a worse situation by the time this is over, unless they get a lot of international help. Can they recover, and what is that contribution? How can they be a more active part of a more successful future? And we've lost you a little bit, and again, it's the old you're on mute problem.
Oh,
sorry about that.
Sorry, my fault. You would think I would have figured this out by now. Just as we can't discount, underestimate how severe this supply chain disruption has been in the pandemic and the impact it's had on poor countries in Africa, we should not discount the possibility that there is going to be a new tangent in history coming out of this in terms of the learning effects. And I think that in Jeremy's comments, he's pointed now at different times both to the domestic roadmap for a renaissance for countries if they can learn the lessons technologically, politically, and financially and act according to them, and then the international sort of potential that exists as well. And I want to echo that trajectory, that sentiment that he's laying forth, because there is that roadmap. And when it comes to Afro-Eurasia, let's not pretend that, again, the rapid recovery of those trans-Indian Ocean trading networks and the linkages among the billions of people who live on the Indian Ocean coast across Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and East Asia are suddenly going to sort of dry up, right, or evaporate. That's not the case. There is a very strong interdependency and complementarity among the economies of East African, West Asian, South Asian, and East Asian societies. And so the Indian Ocean remains and will absolutely continue to be the epicenter of the global trade in goods, whether it is automobiles, steel, commodities, agriculture, and so forth. And there will also be in Africa reforms that if you're following the conversations that are happening beyond the crisis management in Africa, it's actually quite interesting. There is a recognition that they now have to become more self-sufficient in food, in energy, in any category, any categories of areas where they were very import dependent in order to avoid, a calamity. And I think that lesson is going to be very deeply entrenched coming out of this. And Africa does have the capacity to do that. So I would still be quite optimistic, quite frankly, especially about East Africa. I would be less optimistic about West Africa. Jeremy mentioned Nigeria earlier. I don't believe that you get a Nigeria of 350 or 400 million people prior to having the complete collapse of that territory that we today refer to as Nigeria. So I don't think that we can look strictly at population dynamics and growth rates without taking into account the consequences of those that happen along the way, because having a large population is the best thing until it's the worst thing. And I have a feeling that in a place like Nigeria, much like in India, it's the worst thing before you make it a good thing. And that is a very kind of a layman's way of talking about how India has never really lived up to this notion of a demographic dividend. And I'm not sure that it will, even coming out of the pandemic. I hope that it will, because it has a very large young population. But you only have a large young population for some amount of time. You can't just let it become a large and continuously and still underemployed and underskilled middle-aged population, because that's a bit of a disaster.
Jeremy, when we look at the differential rates in the world in terms of population movement, in terms of population growth, and particularly looking at the population in Africa and the consequences, with regards to the economic development and the social development on the continent, what will that do in terms of geopolitical shift or not shift in power around the world?
Well, again, that's fascinating. I mean, I think if I can take up Parag's point.
Please go ahead, yes.
Yeah, if I can take up Parag's point about the significance of regionalism. In Africa, regionalism is being hit very hard by struggles within and between states. Whereas in Asia, although there are tensions, and we know there are tensions at the moment in the East and South China Seas, there is no comparable degree of violence between states. And the major violence within a state at the moment, in Myanmar, in Burma, has not really, as it were, moved over into its neighbours. But if you look, for example, at Africa at the present moment, the struggle in northern Ethiopia, which has been going on now for some months with quite heavy casualties, involved Eritrea from the outset. We now, on top of that, have a degree of Sudanese involvement. The capacity to think through regional solutions is much more compromised in Africa by the extent to which divisions within countries, and one can think of this pattern, we've seen it in Congo, we've seen it in Angola, we've seen it in West African states like Cote d'Ivoire or Sierra Leone, the way in which other states are drawn in. And I think that's an enormous problem in Africa. And I mean, it adds to the cost. I mean, if you think about it, if you're going to take an economic viewpoint on this, and I think economics is tremendously helpful, you could argue that political instability is in part a product of economics, that in a way, if you're a young adult male or if you're in an army colonel, your opportunities for employment, for wealth, for prestige may well rest on using force, whether within a military system or from a military system. And you could argue that in a sense it's the weakness of the African economies that have encouraged an extent of political instability. Now, obviously that's not the only factor. The limited nature of civil society in many of these states, some of them blame it on the period of European colonial rule, which may well have been partly responsible. But I think it's fair to say that most of these countries, the European colonial power left in 1960 or thereabouts, and yet they've had 60 years and they haven't really created necessarily a sufficient social fabric to produce the political stability that's going to take the economics forward. So to take Parag's point, I think he's right on the East African coast, but only some of those East African countries are stable. Tanzania is much stabler than Somalia, for example. Mozambique at the moment is showing high levels of instability in the north. There are real problems in Sudan. So I would argue that these are problems, and obviously you're coming from Abu Dhabi. As you would know, there is an extent to which the Middle East has to consider the situation in Northeast Africa. There are traditional links between the Middle East and areas of Northeast Africa, particularly both the coast of Sudan, particularly Somalia, particularly Djibouti, and particularly the Swahili coast further south. Now, all of these areas have potential. They have enormous potential if you're an investor in the Middle East. But equally, written across all of them is enormous dangers about instability, about the breakdown and destruction of any infrastructure that you might be putting in. So I would agree with Parag about the crucial nature of infrastructural investment, but in many of these countries, infrastructure itself is part of now the target for interstate tension, as with Ethiopia's plans for reservoirs and the threat from Egypt to bomb them, or in northern Mozambique with the attempt to create an enormous production of natural gas, and again that attracting the attack of terrorist groups. So one can be optimistic, but there's also a lot of reasons for doubt, and there is a real extent to which in that region, I mean, in fact it's an extraordinarily complex multiplicity of regions, but if we want to use that term, in that region politics is a cost on economic development and therefore a cost on social progress.
And we're getting a few questions in from our audience. Thank you so much. And indeed, if anybody here in the audience in person has questions too, please let me know as we go through. Before I move on to those questions, Parag, if I might continue what Jeremy is talking about in terms of Africa a bit, but also when we look at the role of the Middle East and the rising role of the Middle East, and we look at development, here in the UAE and indeed in Saudi Arabia, what, does the whole geopolitical shift look like for the Middle East? Or indeed, as you say in the book, that your grandfather used to call it West Asia. So is it Middle East, is it West Asia? We have to look out to Africa on one side, we have to look to Asia, and indeed both areas hugely strategically important for the Middle East. Talk to me about the role of the Middle East and what it will play in the coming years.
Well, part of what's happened over the last 30 years is that these West Asian countries, particularly the Gulf countries and the petro exporters, have reoriented thoroughly towards countries to the east. The GCC countries, such as the UAE and Saudi Arabia, trade about 3 times more with India, China, Japan, Korea, and so forth than they do with Europe. So obviously there's a very spectacular reversal in sort of alignment really from the European colonial era to the present day, where indeed not only geographically, and of course the geography hasn't changed, but very much economically, it is West Asia. Institutionally, Gulf countries have joined the Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, of the last 15 years of Chinese foreign investment into the Gulf countries, more than half of it has been in just the last 4 or 5 years. And it's also diversified beyond oil and gas into a wide range of other areas like real estate, manufacturing, and so forth. And then the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has the UAE as its regional hub, not only for the broader Middle East, but also for Africa. So when you talk about the Middle East, honestly, it must be broken down in the ways that Arabs themselves would break it down, which is, of course, Maghreb, Mashrek, Khalij. And these are 3 entirely different geopolitical ecosystems. When we talk about the geopolitical role of the Middle East, in terms of agency, the ability to shape affairs outside of its own immediate geography, we're only talking about the Gulf, right? We're not talking about, Morocco. We're not talking about Syria, right? So, and when we're talking about the Mashrek, we're obviously talking about a very turbulent region, very volatile region, and so forth. So I don't think that it's fair to the term Middle East, which is itself a term that I obviously heavily criticize. It's not even fair to that term to have all the countries of the so-called Middle East even referred to in a common way. They don't have all that much in common anymore. But the Gulf countries as increasingly confident agents that have managed to ride out the volatility in global commodities markets, ride out the geopolitical volatility in the region, to make investments in economic diversification such as they're doing, to try to invest more in human capital. It's not a perfect story. There's a lot of, let's say, friction along the way. There's a lot of, sort of inefficiency along the way. But I would say, as someone who obviously does come to the Gulf very regularly, I see it as a genuine effort. And I don't see that level of effort being made elsewhere in the region, and certainly not in many other parts of the world. So I would certainly continue to put my, money, if you will, behind the Gulf continuing down this road, but I wouldn't make any such bets for North Africa or for the Mashrek.
And Jeremy, when we look at...
By the way,
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Gauri. No, please. I'm done.
Okay, we'll come back to you in a moment. But Jeremy, when we look at the role of the Middle East too and how this has shifted, particularly in the relationships with America, once dependent on Saudi Arabian oil and that, and also looking at, I think, the awareness of the world in terms of emissions, in terms of climate change, in terms of a greener future, and huge demands and almost legislation, even this weekend we're hearing to, been put on the international oil companies whereby they have to do something. So there's a big shift in terms of the power of oil producers as such. Where is that leaving the Middle East when you look back on its history and probably look to the future?
Well, I think the Middle East has been affected, like much of the world, by the enormous social changes that really came in from the 19th century onwards, and much of the world only came in the second half of the 20th century. So the large-scale movement of people off the land, the urbanization, the ability to cope then with differing political, social alignments, different practices of deference and hierarchy, and so on and so forth. Now, that was a challenge in parts of the Arab world, just as it's a challenge in parts of the non-Arab world. I mean, and I think Parek's point that one mustn't see the Middle East as a unity is absolutely true. After all, we don't describe Europe in terms of what happened in Bosnia in the 1990s, so we shouldn't use some similar failure or breakdown in, let's say, modern Libya to describe the entire Middle East. I think that the issue and problem for a while in the Middle East was that the solution to as it were, the economic questions produced by social change, urbanization and such like, was very much located in oil. And I think that's correct. And I think what that did was create particular problems for non-oil states or low oil states such as Egypt, and it created a very different scenario for oil states, the problems of strong dependence. But I think Parek's absolutely right that the Gulf in particular, which has shown a very high level of political maturity here, has been moving away from this over-dependence for a long time. It's been looking at diversification. It's been looking at how to get a multiplied value out of its talent and out of its capital. And, I think it's doing very well in that respect. I mean, what would be tragic is if one expects in the outside world the Gulf to be, as it were, holding the responsibility for keeping peace throughout the Middle East. That's an absurdity, just as you wouldn't expect let us say, an individual or a small number of African powers to be responsible for keeping order throughout the whole of Africa. So I think that if we disaggregate the Middle East, if we say, look, there are some areas there that are doing extremely well, there are some areas there that are doing badly, what this moves away from is any attempt at a simplistic cultural explanation, a kind of Samuel P. Huntington explanation. And what instead we can do is note real talent and ability in some centres, and in other areas a failure to break through to political order.
Yeah, indeed, there are still many challenges in this region and in many areas around the world. Parik, make sure your microphone is on. I have a few questions here that we have coming up from our audience here. And one looking at says, has George Orwell's 1984 come true with the global advances in AI and facial recognition? And how is this making an impact? How do you see this changing our world right now?
So there is, of course, the growing capacity for surveillance states, and to some degree, states have not yet, not even close to fully implementing or deploying at scale the capabilities that they do have, whether it's facial recognition, voice recognition, and other kinds of surveillance tools. And there's many reasons for that. Even in China, there is, for those who are looking closely at the internal Chinese discourse, there is a fair bit of pushback, even from the Chinese companies that are under state pressure to not enable the government to have such pervasive powers. So I think that's obviously a healthy sign, even if it doesn't ultimately prevent the government from having access to those technologies. But have we reached the full kind of 1984 scenario? I think that we're not there yet. But because what we have today is a very high degree of transparency among the public, the technology community. Let's remember that companies like Amazon, like Google, have been pressured both internally or even by their own management to refuse certain government contracts that would further enable this kind of surveillance. So we have a broader social awareness, we have strong civil society movements, we have watchdog groups, we have the technology community, we have obviously congressional regulators and others themselves within the federal government, certainly in the United States, strong pushback. Countries, of course, within Europe, I should say, where there's an absolute sense that the people must own their data. And so in that sense, you have not only just a sentimental counter movement, you have it constitutionally entrenched. The right to be forgotten, the right to privacy, the right to delete, your digital history and so forth in places like Germany. So I wouldn't make, universalistic, sort of dystopian claims just yet. Is the technology highly, worrying in terms of its power? Yes. But are we very much still as societies at a stage where we can shape it, more for benefit than for harm? That is also true.
Now, Jeremy, we still have a few questions to get through from our audience, and one here I'm going to double it up with a question that I had, and this one is, what emerging geopolitical issues are we not paying attention to? Or perhaps, Jeremy, what might worry you that is not up there on sort of the top of the agenda? When we look back at, you've written about history and about political warfare and international relations, even going back to the 1700s, 1800s, right up to the modern day. Do we learn anything from history? Do we learn enough from history? And again, what do you think that we really need to be watching right now?
Well, I think uncertainty. I think the one thing that history teaches you is that time doesn't occur in a linear pattern. So therefore we need to, as it were, have hardwired into our economic and political systems the ability to cope with the unexpected. That is very, very, very difficult if you are encouraging people to always think that things are going to get better. And to that extent, maybe if you're looking for a silver lining unto this pandemic, it will be that it encourages people to have a measure of skepticism about the fact that they might feel that they're entitled to always live in a happier and more benign world. I'm sceptical about that. Can I just talk about Parak's very good point in the question, very good question about 1984? A society is strongest when it carries with it much, you can never carry all, when it carries with it much of its population. So if you're looking at the present moment in the world, Belarus is an authoritarian society that is suppressing its people. Its next door neighbor is Lithuania. Lithuania is a stronger society. I mean, if you look at the early 1980s, Argentina was a very weak society. The Argentinian junta could kill individual people. They did kill them, throw them out of aeroplanes, do whatever they liked. But you're actually a very weak society if you need a secret policeman at everybody's shoulder. So in part, I would argue that the surveillance is neither here nor there. I mean, it's important at the margins. The key question is, how do we get the cooperation of much of a society to accept the notion of shared benefit and shared responsibility in order to get an economy and a society and a political system to work? And in some cultures that operates well, in some cultures it doesn't. There is no one answer. Offering surveillance machines will help on the margins, but it's not going to actually provide the answers. It's only a technique.
Parak, carrying on from that, I mean, in terms of some governments, they have different attitudes, what cooperation of society might mean. And you talked earlier, you know, about the youth being very vocal and maybe not happy with their government in some areas. Tying this in with a question here in terms of will the way that the West is shutting down discussion and becoming woke, will this have an impact on geopolitics in terms of what we're seeing right now?
Well, you know, to the extent that it has an impact on geopolitics, it's a spillover effect, a second order effect from the domestic instability that it creates and the ways in which it decays the attempt of the state or the goal of the state to be a competent, rational entity that acts in a utilitarian fashion and in the spirit of what Jeremy said earlier, again, lifting up all of society. So I do believe that this is perhaps a good way to tie in back to your very, very first question at the outset of our discussion, which is around Asia and geopolitics and the post-pandemic landscape. What Asian countries have done by and large, and by that I do mean mostly Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, you might say Japan to some degree, have demonstrated that there can be a blend of democracy and technocracy in which matters of national public interest, where social solidarity is at a premium, cannot be undermined simply by specific kinds of parochial agendas. Whether it is wokeness or libertarianism or whatever the case may be. There must be a state that is trusted to act in the collective public interest. And that model has clearly prevailed in this pandemic. And I don't want to say that tentatively. I want to say it with whatever authority I can muster. It has absolutely prevailed. And this is a point that, as you've kindly cited, I've been making for several years, well before the pandemic. I no longer have to make that argument, do I, Etna? I think that that's obvious to the entire world. And now I see media in every country in the world pointing this out without my having to do so. So we have reached that inflection point. I hope that if nothing else, perhaps looking outside one's own borders can provide those lessons for those societies that are rudderless and where these kind of narrow agendas, whether it's wokeness or others, are going to destabilize themselves because they can already turn on the television, pick up the newspaper, or look on the internet and see that they could do better.
Yes, I agree.
Go ahead, Jeremy, you want to come in here?
I agree with every word of that, and I would add that one of the problems with wokeness is it's inherently irrational, because it's taking a belief in where you should be going, and it's using that as a substitute for considering particular options. And as a historian, I would say that here you have the difference between a one or two dimensional perception, which is wokeness, and the three-dimensional perception of being able to understand that different options have validity, and you should work between those to see what is, as Parak said, most utilitarian. So there's no accident that in responding to the pandemic, the actual process of decision making has, irrespective of the quality of the decisions, but the actual process of decision making has been much stronger, much more informed in some societies, and I think Parag's, the ones he's cited, are very good examples, than many other societies which have found it very difficult to move from articulating a general societal goal to actually being able to implement it in terms of policy formulation based on rational principles.
One thing I just want to talk about, that maybe just, there's so many more things we could talk about, we don't have a whole lot of time. Parag, if we look at the whole climate change movement, and we look at, you know, global emissions, and we look at the state the world is in at the moment, and we look at the UN goals, many people say that we don't have a chance to get there. The International Energy Agency just said we've got to stop producing oil and gas like right now if we have a chance to get there. All countries are not moving at the same speed. All countries can't move at the same speed. Where do you see the impact, you know, of the cleaner, greener future when it comes to geopolitics?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, we have to be honest with ourselves and accept the fact that we are past the point of no return in some aspects of the so-called hothouse effects, and certainly the complex dynamics among different dimensions of our ecosystem, and therefore mitigation efforts may continue, but we certainly cannot rely upon them. We have entered a period which will be shaped probably more by adaptation than mitigation. Adaptation can mean multiple things. It can mean everyone for themselves. If you're a coastal population and sea levels are rising, obviously the international community is not going to help you. You are going to be retreating inland, and hopefully your government has begun to make the kinds of internal, meaning the geographically inward investments to repopulate or redistribute the population. And that's the kind of situation that is unleashed by this shift from just thinking mitigation towards accepting the reality of adaptation. Of course, that has geopolitical consequences in many ways. In no particular order, governments have spent trillions of dollars on infrastructure that could just wind up being stranded assets. They could be losing their talent and their population to outflow as people seek to abandon countries that are either flooded or face drought, agricultural failure, and other kinds of climate-induced disaster and economic failure. So there are going to be new population movements and a sort of new war for talent. There could be resource grabs, which is of course geopolitical. So though it isn't necessarily climate driven, Jeremy did mention the situation in East Africa. So we can point to 5 or 6 flashpoints in the world, certainly the headwaters of the South Asian river systems in Tibet and elsewhere are flashpoint, the Mekong River and others. There are 5 or 6 major geographies where there could be competition, military competition over control over water resources and so forth. So that too is part of the so-called adaptation picture, because it could very much result in redrawing the lines on the map.
Yes, can I add on that?
Please.
I see not just tension between states, but tension within them.
Yes.
And I would argue, if you're looking at instability, most instability is within states. I mean, for example, if you're looking at military, if you take the military of South America, it doesn't spend its time fighting other governments or other militaries, it spends its time dealing with instability within states. And I think there's a real problem here, because what we're asking for is a trade-off between, as it were, the benefit of the species as a whole and people's sense of their own particular self, family, community, ethnic or sectarian or whatever group. And in a way, the fuel on that fire, on that contrast, is population rising. I mean, we are at over 7.3 billion. This increase is quite dramatic, and it would be naive to imagine that people are going to have children and those children are not going to want to have a standard of at least housing, fuel, food that provides for themselves and in turn their children. And I cannot quite see, I mean, I admire what the United Nations is doing, but I cannot quite see how there is going to be the trade-off here. And if you add another element, which is that in some societies it proves very difficult to get people to limit their family size, I really can't see grounds for optimism. So that you may well find that, say, Japan, where the population is falling, that it's easier to meet environmental standards. I cannot see that happening in a country Parag and I have already discussed, which is Nigeria, and I think it's naive to think otherwise.
And indeed, it is certainly the big challenge of our time, and a very current one at the moment. We have about a minute left, well, maybe about 30 seconds each. So, Jeremy, I'll stay with you in a moment in terms of what we can do. What do we need to do now? What do you think is the absolute number one, top of the agenda that we really need to be working on to make sure that we do build back better and make life a little better for everybody? 30 seconds for me, please.
I think we do have to increase economic productivity. I think we have to create the wealth that enables new options to be considered and implemented.
Thank you so much. Parag, just some words of wisdom, words of warning, call to action. What do you say?
I think we have to enable mobility. The fact is that we have enormous mismatch between the geography of natural resources, of economic activity, of physical infrastructure, of political stability. There's significant dislocation in the world population, and perhaps the surest way to create a more productive human society is to enable supply to meet demand, so to speak. And so I think mobility, social mobility, and economic mobility also comes through physical mobility, and we're going to have to enable a lot more of that in the future.
Indeed, a time of tremendous challenges as we get through one big challenge, that being the pandemic, and then we continue into the 2020s beyond that. Jeremy Black, professor, historian, author, thank you so much for your time. And Dr. Parag Khanna, founder and managing director of Future Map and author of Looking at Asia, looking indeed at geopolitics in the world. How has the pandemic shifted the power of geopolitics? Thank you so much for that very insightful discussion. I really appreciate it. Thank you. And again, thank you to all of our people here. Thanks very much to everyone who has joined us here at the Abu Dhabi International Book Fair. Thanks to the Arabic Language Centre for actually organising this great book fair, and indeed to all of our tech team for keeping us connected here in person, and of course with all of our people online. It's been great to be able to bring you all of the great topics here. So, and a big thanks to all of our volunteers, to everybody involved in making this a great success. I'm Ethna Trainer from all of the team here. Thank you to us all, and goodbye. Thanks so much. Stay in tune.